more on President Obama's visit and its impact on the region. I'm joined now by Peter Pham. He's director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center here in Washington. So, Peter, President Obama, as we were seeing there, surrounded by relatives. But apart from celebrating family ties, what in concrete terms do you expect him to achieve while he's on the continent?
I think he's got three different major policy priorities. First, as that segment reported, the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, emphasizing the opportunities for greater economic ties between the United States and Africa. Secondly, political and security ties. Kenya is in the forefront of the fight against the Al-Shabaab extremists. It's also an engine in the integration of East Africa through the East Africa community, the fastest integrating region in Africa. And then finally, of course, there's the question of good governance, democracy, human rights, the rule of law.
And as we heard there in that exclusive interview the president did with John Sobel, he's trying to make this link between wealth creation and countering extremism. But it's quite nebulous, isn't it? How does he do that on a trip like this?
Well, I think he emphasizes the inclusive opportunities, because growth that is not equitable, growth that's not inclusive, will inevitably lead, unfortunately, to exclusion and grievances and occasionally violence, as we see all too sadly in our world. But inclusive growth, if everyone is rising and doing better, there's greater stake in society, greater stability.
How worried do you think the US is about the security situation in Kenya? We saw that horrible massacre in the university earlier in the year.
That was a terrible tragedy, and then of course 2 years ago we saw the massacre at the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, and in between those we had dozens of attacks by extremists. But there's good news that increasingly, through the sacrifices of the African Union peacekeeping force, the help that the United States and its European partners have provided, Shabaab is on the run. It's lost territory. Unfortunately, it's still lethal as a terrorist organization, but at least the territorial challenge is much diminished.
Now, the president goes on to Ethiopia, doesn't he? The first ever sitting US president to go there. Why that choice of country?
Ethiopia's had long historic ties to the U.S. It's a country with which we've had diplomatic relations going back a century. Ethiopian soldiers fought alongside GIs in the Korean War. It was an ally in the first part of the Cold War. It's also the second most populous country in Africa. A great potential market. It's producing energy and going to produce more renewable energy through hydropower. So there's economic opportunity, and Ethiopia is important to regional stability. Peacekeeping forces in Somalia, in South Sudan, in other places as well.
But Ethiopia is accused of stifling dissent, isn't it? So how's the president going to get around that one?
I think the president's going to need to address it head on, because American foreign policy is built really on a tripod: economic interests, political security interests, but also democratic values. And all three have to be in balance. Other proportions may vary from case to case, but all three have to be present to be sustainable.
Peter Pham, thank you so much for joining us.